Hello, everybody. My name is Pablo Boczkowski. I'm a faculty member at Northwestern University and director of the Center for Latinx Digital Media. Thank you so much for joining us for today's weekly virtual seminar of the Center. It's really a pleasure to have you with us. The mission of the Center is to create knowledge about digital media in Latinx communities across the Americas. Today's speaker is a leading scholar in that space. Sebastián Valenzuela is Associate Professor of the School of Communications at Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile in Santiago, and also Associate Researcher at the Millennium Institute for Foundational Research on Data. Tomás Guarna, a graduate student in the Comparative Media Studies program at MIT and an affiliate at the Center for Latinx Digital Media, will introduce Sebastián in just a minute. But before we do that, I would like to start by acknowledging that Northwestern is a community of learners situated within a network of historical and contemporary relationships with Native American tribes, communities, parents, students, and alumni. It is also in close proximity to an urban Native American community in Chicago and near several tribes in the Midwest. The Northwestern campus sits on the traditional homelands of the people of the Council of the Three Fires, Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Ottawa, as well as the Menominee, Miami, and Ho-Chunk nations. It was also a site of trade, travel, gathering, and healing for more than a dozen other native tribes, and is still home to over 100,000 tribal members in the state of Illinois. It is within Northwestern's responsibility as an academic institution to disseminate knowledge about Native peoples and the institution's history with them. Consistent with the university's commitment to diversity and inclusion, Northwestern works towards building relationships with Native American communities through academic pursuits, partnerships, historical recognitions, community service, and enrollment efforts. Now, let me say briefly about how the seminar will unfold. First, Tomás will tell us more about Sebastián's research and career in just 1 minute. Then Sebastián will deliver his seminar. After that, we will open for questions. Please enter your questions in the Q&A function of the webinar. Tomás will moderate. At the end, we will deliver some closing remarks. Once again, many thanks for joining us. Without further ado, Tomás, the screen is all yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Professor Boczkowski, for introduction and for allowing me to introduce Professor Sebastián Valenzuela. It is an honor to introduce a scholar whose work is so impactful and so relevant to understanding our contemporary media landscape. Sebastián Valenzuela is a scholar in the intersection between political communications and digital journalism. His research explores the role of journalism and social media on public opinion and democratic citizenship, considering its social, political, and its effective implications. He's an associate professor and research director in the School of Communications at the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile, and an associate researcher at Chile's Millennium Institute for Foundational Research on Data. He recently stepped down as editor-in-chief of Cuadernos.info, a peer-reviewed open access scientific journal that publishes research on communication and media in Latin America. In the past, Professor Valenzuela has been senior visiting professor at University of Wisconsin-Madison School of Journalism and Mass Communication, an associate researcher at Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile's Research for Integrated Disaster Risk Management. Professor Valenzuela has authored 60 articles and chapters, including articles in Communication Research, the Journal of Communication, Human Communication Research, the Journal of Computer-Mediated Communication, Political Communication, and the International Journal of Public Opinion Research. He wrote the 3rd edition of Studying the Agenda with Maxwell McCombs, which was published this year by Polity Press. His research has been awarded by associations such as the International Communication Association, and it has received attention from numerous international news outlets. He also sits on the editorial board for several scientific publications. So please join me in welcoming Professor Valenzuela.
Thank you, Tomás. Thank you, Pablo, also for the introduction and for the invitation. It's my pleasure to be sitting here at my home and speaking to you all wherever you guys are. Thank you for attending. I'm going to share my screen. And always cross my fingers that this thing works. Is it working? You guys see my screen? Yes?
No? Yes.
Okay, excellent. So again, this when I was thinking about what to present, when I received Pablo's and Mora's and you guys here during the center, the invitation to present, I was thinking rather than present on a project I've might be working right now, I was thinking that it would be a good idea to use the opportunity to reflect upon my own scholarship and the work I've been doing on social media and politics, and do that not because I want to show off, but more about like use it as a starting point to have a discussion. So I would really love for you guys to, after I'm done with the presentation, to get questions and get the conversation going. So as any story, we need to start from the beginning, right? So with social media, the funny thing is that beginnings and ends are like 5 or 10 years ago, right? But still seems like eons ago, right? Because it's a fast-moving environment, and when you're doing research on platforms that are changing all the time, all your findings and the way you describe these platforms and the way you study their uses and their effects change at a very rapid pace, right? So once upon a time, and I would say before 2016, I'm going to argue that 2016 was kind of a breaking point in research on social media and politics, as I will try to convey. So before 2016, most of the common wisdom about the relationship between democratic citizenship and social media highlighted a number of aspects. One of them was the idea that social platforms were giving voice to groups that hitherto had no voice, in a way, political voice, right? So people were organizing groups, social groups that had been marginalized before and now had social media at their disposal to get going, either as a group, organize, spread the word, and also engage in all sorts of political activities, right? And I guess the cover of The Economist was a very poignant example, right? Where was comparing the use of smartphones and social applications within that smartphone as the tool to fight, and to organize and get a protest going, just as in the 60s or even the French Revolution were using their own tools at the time, right? So the common wisdom did have some basis on the empirical work. If you study the evolution of social platforms, you would see that between 2007 or 8 up to 2016, there was a very positive trend in terms of the growth of these platforms in terms of users, right? So Facebook, Instagram, Reddit, Tumblr, Twitter, all these platforms were increasing their use. And this coincided, of course, with an increase in direct action, political action by citizens, and not only in areas that were well covered by the news, such as the Middle Eastern world and the Arab Spring, or in Spain the Indignados movement, or in Greece, but also in our own region, right, Latin America. If you look at the data of protest intensity that the GDLT database provides for everyone to look, they have these nice graphs, and where you can see that on a number of countries, particularly after 2010, you would see an uptake in protest intensity, right? In some countries, it was more pronounced, like in Chile or in Uruguay and in Bolivia. In others, not so much, like in Peru. But overall, the idea was that between 2010 and 2015, you would see all sorts of social movements, environmentalism, women's movements, students, political protest, you name it, right? In many different countries, in many different parts of the world, that were becoming more frequent. And this, of course, coincided with an uptake in the use of social platforms. So the question for many of us who were studying political communication and digital media was to, let's put this idea that makes a lot of sense to kind of an empirical test, right? Like, why would social media use lead to increased political action by citizens, right? At the time, I had finished already my PhD in Texas, so I was back in Chile, where I've been working ever since. Chile made for a very interesting case because on the one hand, the connection between citizens and political elites, which has been not very high always, right? But particularly from a comparative perspective, Chile is a country where you have the most critical citizens of the political parties and the establishment. There you can see a graph. I think that survey was from the 2012 or something like that, and you would see that Chile ranked the worst, along with Peru and Brazil, in terms of trust in political parties. All over Latin America, the figures are pretty low, but in Chile they're particularly low, which has always been interesting because at the same time, Chile has always been touted after the restoration of democracy in 1990 as a country that kind of did things well, right, in terms of a Pacific transition and economic growth and so forth. And on the other hand, at the time, Chile was experiencing its own uptake in terms of social mobilization, particularly among youth cohorts. And youth cohorts, young adults, are of course also the most intense users of social media. So you have all sorts of contextual elements that made for a very interesting case to put into examination the idea that social media were a tool to empower those that don't have power and want to organize and change things, right? And last but not least, as everywhere, but particularly again in Chile among young adults, you would see already before 2016 a steep decline in terms of the role of traditional media and the use of traditional platforms. And on the contrary, a big increase in the use of social media as media to become informed, to become socialized, and all sorts of uses, right? So you have all these different pieces of the puzzle there, and we were interested in saying, okay, let's put this together and start to study more systematically whether social media is something that is having an effect on people's intention to participate and particularly in protest movements, right? Now, when you want to study the effect or influence, the antecedents, you use the synonym you want, but when you want to understand the relationship between media use and some outcome, right? There are kind of two ways of looking at it. One is to literally think that there's this idea of a media effect, right? That there's something that when you use media causes something in an individual or in a group of individuals, and something that becomes activated, and then you either learn something, your opinions, your attitudes change because of that exposure to that media or using that media, and then eventually you change your behavior, right? And that's kind of a very typical way of doing work in political communication, right? Media effects. So if before it was TV, and then it was the internet, and then websites, and now social media, and now we study mobile, right? But the problem with that idea is that it doesn't take into account the reverse relationship, meaning it's not that people use media and because they're using, for example, social media, they become interested in politics and they become more engaged. Maybe it's the other way around. Maybe for some reason, people get interest in social movements or in participating in politics or in getting organized. And once they have this interest and this behavior, they select media that will enable them to accomplish their goals, right? This idea of selectivity, right? That participants that are users that are politically participatory use media more often. And the problem with the data is that you can do a survey, for example, right? And you can ask questions about how often you use social media and how often you participate. And then you do some kind of correlation. But the problem with that is that even if you find a correlation, you don't even really know whether it's because social media is causing this behavior, this interest, this engagement, or is the other way around, right? So back in the day, we would say, and this is like 2010, 11, 12, like less than 10 years ago, that was kind of the state of the art in terms of thinking about it. So with colleagues here from Universidad Diego Portales, they had a survey that they would field every year on a fresh sample, right? But it was a representative survey of young adults, Chileans that are between 18 and 29 years old. And every year they would have this survey where they would measure all sorts of political behaviors, attitudes, and cognitions, and also media use, right? So between 2009 and 2012, there was a huge, two big social movements among young adults here in Chile. One was the student movement, and the other one was the environmental movement. The student movement was the big one because it had like everlasting consequences, not only in educational policy, but also in terms of really helping Michelle Bachelet to win for the second time the presidency and adopt a number of reforms at the time. But anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. The thing was, this is a period where you would have an uptake of mobilization, and we have the surveys. So we thought, why don't we use this data that has been collected at different times to check whether social media makes a difference, right? And to really parse out whether it's selectivity or it's a media effect. And the way you do that with survey data, there are a number of ways of doing it, but the way we did it was to analyze the data differently from what most people were doing at the time, and is to take kind of an experimental, kind of a quasi-experimental approach to it. Instead of doing just a correlation between how often you use social media and how often you participate, rather, we would compare people. We would select from these large surveys, we would select people that were very similar in a number of characteristics, demographics, attitudes, and so forth, except that some of them at the time were more intense users of social media, and others were either didn't have accounts on social media or were only use it, very, in minimal fashion. So two groups that were very similar in a number of things, but just differed basically in terms of how often they use, whether they used and how often they used Facebook and Twitter, which at the time were the platforms that were taking hold. I'm doing some statistical wizardry that I'm not going to get into details, but basically you compare these groups as if it was an experiment, meaning one group was the treated group, the other one is the control group. And what we find is that in general, even if you take into account the possibility of selectivity, we found evidence that was consistent with the media effect. The interesting thing was that this effect varied over time. It was least important at the height of the student movement. So when everyone is mobilized, no one cares about social media. That's the 2011 data. But before, and particularly after, so when the movement, so people were on the streets and now they're back home, to put it metaphorically, social media becomes more important. Why? Well, we speculated it's because social media is a way of get going the movement in 2010, or of reinforcing, amplifying what took place so that it doesn't die off as any protest cycle happens. You have eventually the movement dies off, right, before taking up again. So that was the other lesson. These things between social media and political participation are not fixed in time, of course, and in some contexts they're going to be very prevalent, and in others not so much. So okay, we said fine. We found some evidence, even taking into account selectivity, that there might be a media effect. Then we said, okay, Chile, very interesting, but who cares about Chile, right? We want to have some claims about generalizing this thing. So we repeated this analysis in another study with colleagues now from also Universidad Católica. And basically what we found was that in most countries where social media use was getting critical mass, you would see in general an uptake in terms of political behavior, even when you took into account other influences. In some countries, the slope the relationship between the two is steeper, in others not so much. But in general, we would find a positive relationship. So the second question then we had was, okay, fine. We find something that resembles kind of a media. But the question, and I think the most interesting question is why or how? How does it that using social media really influence participation, right? So we went back, checked the literature, and then we kind of said social media is a very complex medium because unlike, for example, newspapers, you can do a number of things, right? Many things. So we decided to study activities that you can conduct easily on social media that have a chance of being a mechanism for getting people engaged in politics in general, particularly in social movements and protest behavior. And so we decided, okay, let's settle on these three mechanisms: information, deliberation, mobilization, and test whether these three, one of them, none of them, two of them, who knows, which is the mechanism by which using social media more frequently, you will become more engaged. So in another paper, using the data from the surveys that we had conducted with young people, we, in 1 year, we measured these mechanisms, right? So using social media for opinion expression, or using social media for learning about what's going on and for news and public affairs, or using social media to learn about political causes or social causes. And what we found was that, of course, first, the more you use social media, the more likely you are to engage in these different activities. But the most interesting thing was that not all these activities were equally important to explain, in this case, protest behavior. Some of them were more important, particularly opinion expression and activism. And using social media for learning about what's going on had no relationship with that, which for some of you who have been studying this now makes a lot of sense. At the time, we were like banging our heads like, how is it that using social media for news doesn't lead to participation? But now we have a bunch of theories that we could use to explain that. But anyway, the interesting thing was that some mechanisms are more important than other mechanisms. But the fact that we found at least one, in this case, two mechanisms, kind of made for a more complete picture of how is it that using social media can really engage people. Now, all of this is part of the optimistic account, right? We were finding social media are making people to participate, are making people more participatory, and this is not random. This is not because, you know, it's a fluke in the data. It's actually, it makes a lot of sense. And it makes a lot of sense because social media, for example, gives voice to opinions that you wouldn't encounter before. So the more you express yourself, the more likely you are to participate, and social media is giving a space for you to express that you wouldn't find somewhere else. So at the time, we had all these ideas about Habermas, dream, you know, being, you could find it somehow in social media. And this is just 2013 or 14. But anyway, we were young and restless. And then we thought, okay, fine with those activities, but that's kind of a very psychological way of looking at it, right? And we know that in the end, politics is not about so much psychology, but also a lot about sociology, right? Meaning we participate because our reference groups participate. So in another study, trying again to kind of find a route by which we could explain in a more comprehensive way, how is it that using social media really engages people, politically speaking. We borrow from this idea from Mark Granoller, the famous sociologist, of strong ties and weak ties, which is kind of a classic or a seminal work in social networks. And we borrow from him this idea that it makes a lot of a difference with whom do you contact, or with whom do you have conversations, with whom do you connect, right? And this idea of strong ties and weak ties is a simplification, of course, of how things really take place. But basically, the interesting thing was that it gave us the inspiration to think about social media is being used to connect with people that that we've been connected before, but somehow it makes it for a more efficient connection. And maybe different platforms and that's why they are so addictive, exploit this idea, right? Exploit the the idea of facilitating the way we connect with other people. So strong tie networks, Granover says that they are the people that with whom we share some level of intimacy, a lot of reciprocity, usually our close friends, our close co-workers or colleagues, our neighbors sometimes if we have really close relationships, of course, our family members. With them, we have strong ties, right? But then we also have weak ties. So we're connected with other people, not at the same level of intimacy or emotional investment that we have with our strong ties, but they're really important because weak ties, for example, acquaintances, bring new information to the system. So for example, if you're looking for a job, this would be an idea for another, right? It's not very smart to just ask your siblings or your family members or your close friends, most likely because if you're jobless and a job opportunity shows up, you will already know because they would already tell you, right? If you really want to cast a wide net in terms of learning about new opportunities, weak ties would be the most important type of contact because with them, you contact less often. And the idea that when you have a contact with them, they're going to inject to the system, basically, new information. So we thought maybe weak ties are very good at getting you connected with politics and getting you engaged by means of contributing new information that you didn't have before, meaning you learn from your weak ties. You learn about politics, you learn about a new cause or a new issue, and that might pique your interest, right? And strong ties, on the other hand, maybe they're not so good at providing you with new information, but they're very good at social reinforcement and peer pressure, which are very important when you are studying complex behaviors such as political participation. Political participation is not something that you can do easily, right? You have to know about something. You have to be out there, willing to show yourself or talk to other people and so forth. Strong ties, weak ties, two different mechanisms, and social media, some of them are very good at enable you to cultivate one or the other or both. So we did this study with this idea of ties and weak ties and strong ties, and what we found was that Facebook was really good at helping you manage your strong ties, while Twitter was very good at helping you manage your weak ties, your weak tie networks. The interesting thing was that both weak ties and weak ties and strong ties are very important to engage in political participation, right? So, okay, now we have a more clear picture of what's going on. We have the causes. We were super excited, but we were missing a big thing, right? And what was that? What exactly people are doing on social media. So now we know with whom do you connect, why the motivations they have, the kind of people they connect to each other, and how all these matters for participating. But what we really didn't know was what exactly are they, what material, what content are people being exposed to? And particularly interesting was the idea of sharing, right? So at the time, the idea of sharing content was kind of the big thing with social media. Social media are media to share your interests, to share news, to share jokes, to share memes of Bielsa, right? Stuff. Now, of course, as being political communication scholars, we're boring people. So we were interested not in sharing that fun part, but the dull news of the day, right? So in another study, we were interested in trying to explore what kind of news people share and why do they share the kind of news they share when they decide to share on social media. Again, Latin America and particularly Chile, very good case studies for this. I think actually this is the only graph that I could find where Chile beats Brazil, or at least ties, right? Because we always lose in terms of soccer and football and all that, right? Argentina, Mexico, Brazil, and Chile, they are world champions in sharing news weekly compared to other countries, right? And the question makes it even more interesting. Why are we obsessed in this part of the world with sharing news on social media, right? So we did a content analysis of 6 different news sites in Chile, and we sampled a representative sample of news stories published by these news websites over a whole year, right? A whole 2014. And we did a manual content analysis, and then we complemented that with some automated content analysis. And although I have a strong inclination for quantitative methods, this is kind of the projects where qualitative methods really help you and are like super important. So what we did was to, on top of this content analysis, we did a bunch of interviews with journalists and editors that were working in these news websites and trying to get to understand how do they decide what stories to put on the website, how does social media influence their work and the agenda and so forth. So the first thing we found was something that everyone finds when you do a content analysis of sharing everything, which is this long curve, right? So most stories never get any shares and only a minority of them become viral, right? And that's kind of the reality, the law of virality. In the end, only few stories are widely shared. Most people don't care about them and no one shares them, right? In our case, it was like 80 or 90% of the stories never got more than 10, 15 shares on Facebook and on Twitter. So the first thing we found was that giving credence to this idea that social media provide kind of a new public sphere in a way, or an alternative sphere to traditional media, was this finding that journalists or the websites where they were publishing the stories, they were giving a lot of coverage to particular topics that the audience on Twitter and on Facebook couldn't care less, right? In our case, entertainment, sports, social issues, politics, and crime were like the topics that garnered the most number of stories on these websites over the whole year. And some of them were also important for Twitter or for Facebook, but those that I marked in red, they were not. Science and technology never makes it in the most covered category in news, but it really made for the most shared stories on Twitter. Economy and jobs on Facebook was really important at the time in Chile, and that didn't make the top agenda in the news website. So already one important finding. And the other thing was in this project was that we were really interested in trying to understand what elements on top of issues, right, on the topics, but what particular elements these stories that were more shared had that stories that were less shared didn't have, right? And what we found was that on top of issues, frames, the way the stories are framed are really important for people. The moral frame, so stories that are that have an angle that discussing ethical aspects or normative aspects, people really like them, like to share them. It triggers them to share them. Unlike, for example, the conflict-oriented news, which is completely opposite from what journalists and editors would say in our interviews about how they frame their stories. Most of the editors and journalists prefer the conflict frame, right? And the conflict frame in our study, we found actually depressed sharing, either because Chile is a very conflicted society, so people are fed up with conflict, or there's something with conflict that they just shy away, right? And we also found other stuff that other people have found, like emotions really matter. But what the study inspired us to do was like, okay, so frames seem to matter a lot. But then again, the question is why? Why is it that moral-oriented stories are more shared than, say, conflict-oriented? So we did an experiment where we manipulated frames of different stories, and we exposed different groups of people to these different frames, and then we measured how credible they found the story and how interesting and how enthusiastic, and so cognitive and affective responses. And what we found was that people are very rational, meaning the reason they share more moral-oriented frames compared to the conflict frame was first because they find it more credible, they find it more interesting, and because it triggered their emotions. So they become more aroused by a story that talks about the good and the bad and the evil, right? Compared to a story of he said, she said, which is the typical way of conveying the conflict frame. So looking back, we said we've been doing all this research, which is very fun, but we're finding something that we know like from millennia, right? So from the rhetoric, right, we know that credibility, emotion, matter for making a good persuasive speech. Well, they also matter, and we haven't changed that much in social media, right? So we were at that time when 2016 came. Now, of course, 2020 really beats it. So it looks like 2016 was nothing, right, compared to last year. But at the time, 2016 was a catastrophe, right? So Trump was elected. In Latin America, stuff like the Colombian referendum for the peace accord, was rejected by most of the population whenever West President was going to be supported. In the UK, you have Brexit, which is another surprise. 2016 was kind of the year of the reckoning, right? And of course, right away, the same journalists and news media that 2 or 3 years before were saying social media are a force for good, which is kind of the typical schizophrenia of journalists. And I say that as a journalist myself. So now the culprit was social media. So if before social media was the lighting, the light that illuminated the path for democracy, now social media was to be blamed for all these events that work against, in a way, having a more strong democracy, right? And in our part of the world, 2016 was not so much the year of the reckoning, but it was actually 2017 when we had presidential elections. Why? Because in 2017 was really when the problem of fake news had its debut, right? And being here in Chile, working on these topics, we thought, instead of thinking about fake news in the US, why don't we study our own issues here, right? It seems that fake news was a big issue in this election. Why don't we study it? And there was, from anecdotal evidence, a lot of leverage to think that that in countries like in Chile, fake news, misinformation might be a big problem when you are studying the role of social media in politics, and maybe it was necessary to go into this topic instead of keep working on the path that we have been working before about showing all the greatness of social media and how it connects people and makes it more participatory. In 2017, then candidate Piñera, which had been an ex-president, then was running again in 2017. His campaign started to argue that we had a fraud in the election, which many of you in the US might ring a bell with that idea, right? So there's been a fraud, but this was after the first round, so the first round of the election. So we had a runoff. So between the first round and the runoff, there was this accusation. Of course, no basis for that, not because I'm saying it, because actually there was an investigation and the election commission said there's no evidence of this. It didn't matter, because what happened was that the Piñera campaign got its people mobilized. They're gonna steal the election, so we gotta mobilize. So record mobilization by Piñera and his coalition. And then what happened? Piñera won the election, right? The interesting thing was that only a few weeks after he won, he actually admitted that the whole thing was really unnecessary. That was his take. But it made for a very interesting example of how social media can be used to spread beliefs or ideas that can get people to mobilize, but become mobilized because of the wrong reasons, right? Or based on fake accusations in this case. So it was our own reckoning in a way. Like we had been arguing that social media connects people and that's why it's good. And now we had an example where we thought, yeah, it connects people, it mobilizes, but maybe it's not so rosy, right? So we started to think about maybe what we think it's contradictory, it's not, it's all connected. We had been studying at the time the relationship between using social media and participation and claiming that that was something super good. And that's the optimistic part. But on the other hand, we were, not seeing here in Chile and elsewhere that this activism online can translate into sharing misperceptions or misinformation, fake news, and all this is connected, right? So with this idea on hand, we did a paper where we tested if there was a positive relationship between these three gears, and that's when we inaugurated our research on misinformation, which is kind of the pessimistic part, right? So we measured in a survey exposure and beliefs regarding all sorts of conspiracies, rumors, and so forth. They're an example of that. So, for example, the accusation that votes were marked in favor of the opposition candidates, 84% of the sample was exposed to that. Now, a sizable minority, a third, which coincides with being a Piñera supporter, actually thought that that was true. So this is kind of the questions we were measuring. And then we tested whether there was a relationship between participation, using social media, and beliefs and sharing these kind of claims. And what we found was actually that, unfortunately, that was actually the case. The more you increase your activism or participation, the more likely you are to share all sorts of content, including false claims and unsupported false news, right? So we said, okay, the story is not so rosy. So now are we beginning to see the flip of the coin, right? So we inaugurated, after that first study, a kind of a new line of work where we decided to probe further this idea of social media being a conduit of misinformation, fake news, and what consequences this has, right? So in another study, we connected the idea of being exposed on social media to these false, incorrect ideas or rumors, conspiracies, fake news. I don't really like that term, but and I'm trying to see what other things can have this exposure, what can it damage, right? So the first candidate we had was trust, right? So the more you believe in an alternative reality, the less likely is that you're going to trust conveyors of that reality, such as the news media, right? So building on the same study that we did with participation and misinformation, that was a two-wave study. We added a third wave, so we interviewed once again our respondents, and this time we measured news media trust and trust in the media, or media cynicism. If you're positive, you say media trust. The opposite of media trust is media cynicism. So what we thought we would find was kind of this cycle, this vicious circle of the more misinformed you are, the less you trust the news media, the less you trust the news media, the more misinformed you are. So kind of a downward spiral of cynicism regarding the news media, regarding political facts and political reality. But what we found was little evidence of that. Actually, what we found was that being misinformed is very predictive of being misinformed, and staying misinformed. And trusting the news media doesn't shield you from being misinformed. And it's like a very stable picture. There's some influence with that thin arrow between misinformation and media cynicism, but not really evidence of a spiral. So we thought, okay, so things are bad, but it seems that they're not that bad. But then maybe we thought, maybe the problem is misinformation. Maybe misinformation is not really the biggest threat of social media to democratic citizenship. Maybe it's something else. So we look for another candidate. Everyone thinks that social media is gonna lead you to an echo chamber, and that's why everyone is fighting all the time on Twitter and on Congress and all that, right? So we said, why don't we study the relationship between social media and political polarization, right? And Chile, again, is a very good case study. We only had a estallido social less than a year ago, and that kind of evidence of polarization. So using another data from another survey, this time was not an online survey, but actually a face-to-face survey we did in Santiago. We measured these two things: exposure to news on social media, or what people say it's algorithmic news, and attitude extremity, like how extreme you are in terms of your issues, and also in affective terms. How do you perceive people who don't think like you do, right? So issue position and affective, two ways of measuring extremity. I wanted to see the connection between the two. Again, what we thought we would find was like this spiral of the more polarized, the more you use social media, you become more polarized, and this thing is gonna lead citizens astray, right? What we found, nothing of that. Like, not even close, like zero relationship. There was no relationship between attitude extremity and social media or algorithmic news. Actually, if there was a link, it was between being more polarized and using traditional media, newspapers, TV more frequently. So we thought at first that maybe it's a problem of the design of the analysis. So we started to torture the data. Let's try this model. Let's try this other one. And let's put nothing works. Like, regardless of how you torture the data, no relationship, right? So we said, okay, last year, let's do something. COVID-19. Now, this is a really extreme scenario. I'm sure we're going to find negative effects of social media and different markers of democratic citizenship in an adverse context as COVID-19 is, right? So we went back to the field. We had this large survey out there measuring all sorts of things. We conducted after the estallido social, and then we interviewed them in the middle of the pandemic. And we were so positive that we were going to find relationships there, but we found nothing in terms of social media doing something. So, for example, this is just one, and with this I start to finish. Trusting government. I mean, the credibility of the current government is pretty low. But after the pandemic arrived, actually it increased, like kind of a small rally around the flag effect, right? When you analyze the basis of that rally around the flag effect, there's stuff that matters, right? Like if you live in Santiago, if you supported the protests of 2019, you are more likely to be skeptical of the government and the other way around. But social media per se had no effect, like it didn't matter. So this reminds me of the idea that social media, at least in Chile, and for that matter, I would say in Latin America, doesn't really have any effect. Like it's not even a thing about being positive or negative or null effects, but they're tiny effects. And this is the argument that Pablo and Eugenia and Mora have done in this paper that was published like 12 days ago, right? That if anything, they amplify rather than transform or cause something of a big change. And this is very consistent with another idea that has been increasingly becoming kind of the consensus in the field, right? The idea that social media are neither good or bad, but it's something like in between. Now, of course, this nuanced view is really unpopular. A friend of mine, a very good friend of mine, Paul Alonso, the other day when he saw the the ad for this seminar on my Facebook, he said, "Oh, you're so boring. We live in in Manichaean times, right?" But the thing is that the empirical evidence leads me to conclude that, unfortunately, it's not a black or white thing. Unfortunately, meaning to make a more compelling story, right? In the end, the big conclusion is that social media matters, but doesn't really matter the way we think it matters, or the way a lot of journalists or a lot of concerned policymakers think it matters. And in a way, that would be, I would say, the biggest conclusion of all these 10 years of doing research in this area. I know it's not a very sexy conclusion, but I would say that, to me, is the big takeaway of the whole thing. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Professor Valenzuela, for this great presentation and for sharing these amazing insights. And I was wondering if we took a different perspective of more like civic engagement rather than, for example, just political participation, understanding that social media might have an interesting social purpose, for example, for leading discussions, for generating conversations around political topics. And if I'm correct, your research would not back this hypothesis, right? It seems like social media doesn't serve that civic purpose, right?
I mean, I think in the end, it's more like it's the glass half full or half empty. My big problem is like their common wisdom is wrong in this area. That's what I would say. I would fight with the idea that social media are a revolution in terms of the way we understand democratic citizenship. All those claims are based on extreme cases. And for every single successful case where you could argue that social media really mobilized a group of people that otherwise had no way of getting mobilized, there are tons and zillions of other attempts to get mobilized on social media, nothing gets going. The idea of, so news sharing, right? Everyone talks about how social media enables people to distribute content that otherwise wouldn't get distributed. And that might be very true, it is true. But if you think from a more systemic perspective, most news stories, no one cares about them. No one reads them, no one shares them. It's not a problem of affordance. It's not a problem of a future of the, it's more about stories that most people don't care because only a minority of them we can pay attention to. There's a limit to the way we can process. And it makes a lot of sense then that because we have limited attention, although you have tons of content out there that people could share, most of them go completely unnoticed. Is that something new? No, that's something we know from decades of doing research. And social media didn't change that. If anything, it reinforced that. So that would be my take. I'm not saying that social media doesn't matter like per se, they do matter, but they matter in ways that they're different or in a different magnitude than from what is usually described. That would be my take.
Great, thank you. So Daniel clearly asks a question. He wonders if there are any indications of a relationship between misinformation and specific political identities. Meaning, he says, if we don't see a general malaise in social media use, there are specific users, for example, Bolsonaro, Piñera supporters have a more propensity for misinformation and radicalization on social media. Good question.
Yes, so what we found is that, of course, some fake stories really resonate with some groups and others resonate with other groups. And a lot of it is because these stories represent a particular identity, either ideological identity or some lifestyle. So for example, in one of the studies, we found that stories about well-being, meaning fake news about herbal treatments or vaccines, organic milk, right? They're very popular on social media. Those that believe those stories and share it usually tend to be people whose lifestyle kind of match that idea of nature against, pharmaceuticals and um, and capitalism, right? Kind of that idea. But at the same time, when you ask about stories about, for example, when we measure misinformation about the estallido social, the big protest of 2019, most of them would be stories that would put the protesters in a negative light, or they would put the um, police and the army in a positive light. People who share that ideology, right, like being more right wing, they would fall for it. So a lot of fake news and misinformation is kind of a projection, and you share it because they project in a way your identity. And so the conclusion to me is that we don't have a problem with fake news. We have to put adjectives or last names to that misinformation. So when we're talking about misinformation and we want to understand the kind of people that fall for it, what kind of misinformation are we asking about? Is it about COVID-19? Well, that group of people is going to be very different from misinformation about politics or misinformation about the environment or something else. And this is different from the way we talk about the problem of misinformation, not only in academia, but it's different from the way we talk about misinformation in policymaking, when you talk about with journalists, or we talk about in Congress when they want to do a law trying to tackle fake news. They talk about fake news as if this, like there's this monolithic thing, and then they think that a particular group, either old people or young people or high income or low income, you name it, but it's always like there's one group that falls for it. And our argument and our findings are like the idea that everyone potentially can be a victim or a perpetrator of misinformation. And it's because this misinformation is very connected to the different identities we have.
Right. Great. There's a question from Mateo Valderrama. They comment that that you seem to approach social media as unitary homogeneous identity above all as static ones, whereas there has been a lot of changes between the social media has been gone through tremendous changes and has been traditionalizing or adopting the logics of all media, and that we should consider the changes of platforms in the analysis.
That's a long question. So if I understood correctly, the idea is the changes in the platforms?
Yes, that we should consider how platforms change in time.
So yeah, there used to be a saying that when you're doing studies on digital media, it's a moving target. I would say that with social media, it's like, I mean, it's not only a moving target, but it's moving at a pace that it's kind of light speed. Even I read my own papers describing how Twitter is like from 2 years ago, and it's like, oh, it's all outdated, right? Which is good, because we tend to think that we need to produce a scholarship that stands the test of time. And I think in this particular area, that's not really, that's something that's worth doing, but we also need studies that have kind of a shorter time span, meaning they are applicable to a particular context, because that's the context that might be important for people to learn about. Like, for example, we know from 5 years from now or 10 years from now that COVID-19 is going to be a memory, right? Maybe we're going to have COVID-28. Let's pray we don't, but we know this is going to happen, right? Does that mean that we shouldn't be studying like everyone a lot what's going on in this particular pandemic? I don't think so. So using the same logic, I would say that there's a tension between the, studying platforms that are changing all the time, or rather forget about platforms and let's think about what's behind it. I understand that, and I've done it. So for example, the studies where I study motivations for using social media is one way of saying, I don't care if at the time it's Facebook or Twitter, and then it's Snapchat and WhatsApp, and then it's going to be something else. because I study motivations, and motivations is a way of kind of a more long-term, stable kind of concept. But I think there's also merit on doing platform studies, right? Because these platforms not only change, but they're very different. Like even the concept social media, I was actually kind of uneasy when I was doing the title of my own presentation, because we talk about social media, but it's like, really? Like Reddit? Are you saying that Reddit is similar to WhatsApp and similar to Facebook and Twitter? I mean, they are complete different universes and not even the same functionalities and different groups and different. So, you know, it's a simplification to use social media, but at some point, you need to really get rid of the label, the concept, and start thinking about, because honestly, not because you find something that it's applicable to WhatsApp, for example, then you think that that's also applicable to other platforms. It doesn't happen because WhatsApp is a closed network, unlike Twitter, which is an open. So anyway, I can go on and on, but it's attention. And I don't have kind of a fixed response. I think you have to do both, kind of long-term conceptual work and also platform, which is, of course, has a expiration date, but that's the way it is.
All right. Thank you so much, Sebastián. Best possible way to conclude a spectacular presentation. I want to thank Tomás for great moderation, the audience for staying with us to the end. It was a truly superb presentation. And I invite everybody to join again next week for the new installment of the winter series of the Center for Latinx Digital Media with Arcelia Gutierrez from the University of Kentucky. Hope everybody has a great rest of your days and weeks, and see you soon on Thursday again. Thank you very much, Sebastián and Tomás.
Thank you, Tomás. Thank you, Pablo. Thank you, everyone, for attending.